We were one of the teams that went to the South Pole with Prince Harry to try and race with a bunch of other wounded veteran organisations to the South Pole. The message underneath it that really connected people to what Soldieron was about, and that is we, the community, should be a part of people's lives when they return from operations overseas or from their military service, so we can support them back into our community. And I think it was that connecting point that allowed people to not just want to be a part of Soldieron from giving some money and walking away, but actually wanting to be involved in the organisation.
So what advice would you be able to give to the people who are listening?
You need to have that holistic focus. Most people plan their careers a lot. They think about what job they want to do, when they want to do it, how it makes you happy, how it doesn't, what's their purpose, meaning and values. But I highly doubt they look at their life in a holistic context and say, what is my success, if you will? And for me, as I said, my purpose across all of these different things. And how does that align to my daily life?
How is all of this whole journey, this experience that you've had from basically following the military's purpose to defining your own, to then living it and creating the businesses?
I think the first part is that
You're listening to another episode of Success with Purpose, where we hold conversations with the most holistically successful people we have the opportunity to connect with. We explore their journeys, their life-changing events, their perspectives, their mindset, and most importantly, their purpose. I'm Harry Goldberg, host, interviewer, and interrogator of this podcast. Father of the most incredible daughter in the world, husband of an incredible woman, and director and empowerment coach at Purpose Advisory. Hope you enjoy this episode, and don't forget to subscribe and like below. Now, let's begin. So let's start with a quick summary of your career for listeners. So you spent 12 years in the Australian Army, serving twice in Afghanistan, completed a Masters of Strategy and Policy, a Masters of Management Studies as well. Since then, you co-founded and led Soldieron Australia as CEO, and a few years ago, you became Managing Director when you co-founded Fortem Australia, which the quick summary is it provides specialized wellbeing and mental fitness support to first responder families, which is actually how we met as well, through hearing you do a wonderful keynote. And so you've had a colorful career and a colorful journey, which we'll be able to dive into, and I'm looking forward to it. But before we go there, how do you define success?
I think for me, success is following your purpose. And to do that, you need to find out what your purpose is, and then you need to be ruthless in focusing on that purpose.
So how do you define what someone's purpose is?
I think you have to find that yourself. You have to identify what it is that you want to do in this world and understand first your values. So what, as an individual, makes you tick? And obviously that comes through your lived experience, your background, but also asking yourself, what do I want to do at the end of my life? When I look back, what is it that I've wanted to achieve? What have I want to left behind or leave behind? And what do I want to be able to do through that period of time to make the world a better place in some way, shape or form? So I think it's recognizing and linking your values with the outcomes that you want to achieve your purpose. And for me, I didn't really know what that was growing up. I didn't really recognize it until, I guess, that watershed moment for me when I came to the realization around Soldieron and setting it up. And that was through the loss of a friend of mine, what my purpose was. And having unlocked that for me, it has really made sense then what, I guess, I want to do for the rest of my life in helping others and supporting others. And up until that point, I was still very happy and content. But having found purpose, I think that for me is a true definition of success.
Okay, so a lot of people, when they're trying to define success, they kind of say, well, you've got to be happy and content in most circumstances, regardless of what's happening in your life. And so that you can still enjoy it while you're doing some meaningful things or achieving things as well. But you've just distinctly separated happiness and content versus purpose and meaning. So what's the difference between those?
I can assure you that the work that we've done with Soldieron and with Fortem, it hasn't always been happy. You're dealing with people sometimes at the worst moment in their life, and their mental health is in a particularly bad space. It's caused issues to them, to their family, to their community. And in some instances, unfortunately, we've known people who've taken their own life. So having a purpose doesn't necessarily mean that every day what you're going to be doing is going to be filled with happiness. And therefore, I think there's a distinct difference between the two. Yes, happiness is something that is wonderful to have, but having it as a goal and as, I guess, for me, the definition of success is short-lived, because ultimately happiness is fleeting and it depends on what day you're in, what situation you're in. And I think with purpose, as I guess my North Star for success, it's something that regardless of how the day is, ultimately it's still there as a key component of what you're trying to achieve. Whereas happiness, as I said, it is dependent on the day, it's dependent on a lot of situations, and ultimately it's dependent on your mental health, your physical location, your wealth. And if you set your success up by happiness also, you can get trapped in chasing happiness, when sometimes what you do won't necessarily make you happy, but it can still be making the world a better place and can lead you to your purpose.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so in that case, if someone's saying, I don't know what my purpose is, they're listening to this and they're saying, wow, that's amazing. I know that I'm happy, I'm content most of the time, but it doesn't mean I'm really enjoying my life enough, or that life doesn't quite feel like it's got that meaning, that purpose behind it. What advice would you give to them?
I think you need to go back to, as I said, what it is that you want to do with your life, and to really understand where you're at and the values you hold. So what is it that's most important to you? Is it family? Is it making a difference in the world? For some people, success is being financially well off. What is it that really is success for you? And then understanding, well, how does that link to, I guess, my purpose? As I said, my definition of success is purpose, but for many other people, it won't be that way. But understanding where you are, what values you have, and then linking that to your purpose. My purpose might be to support my family. I want to make sure that I'm the best dad, the best husband in my situation that I can possibly be. And that is literally my North Star. And that's what I want to do. And then I think you've got to look at your life and say, well, what do I need to do in order to achieve those aims? Like anything, you need to plan to understand where you are, where you want to be. But I think the other aspect, as I said earlier, is to go right to the end, our inevitable end for all of us, and say, on my deathbed, what is it that I want to leave behind? Is that really strong friendships? Is that my purpose? Is it a really strong family network where we're all connected? Is it an incredible bunch of organisations that are changing the world? Is it a lot of money that I can hand on to my family or others to make sure that they're secure and don't need to have the stresses of not being financially well off? So I think it's understanding what it is you want, and then putting that into a plan, but also making sure that plan at the end is still what you want at the end. And I think that's really key, is that people often chase something that feels successful, but when they attain it, it feels empty. And you've got to make sure that you don't have that. So play forward what it is that you really want, and then work backwards to achieve it.
I really like that. I like the forward planning, the future thinking, which I doubt that you would have gotten to where you are today in terms of setting up two very purposeful and meaningful organizations from nothing, if you didn't have such a strong attribute towards planning for the future and thinking forward. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's literally what you do in the military is plan. From day dot, it's how do you get from this point to that? And the other thing is you're constantly seeing risk. So what is going to occur either from environmental factors or potentially opposition factors, i.e. if you're in a combat zone or something like that, you're going to have a potential enemy or will have an enemy. What is that person going to be doing, or that group of people going to be doing to stop you doing what you're trying to achieve? So it's constantly looking at, right, how am I going to have an outcome that I want to achieve with all of these different risk factors? And as you go through those planning processes, you try and de-risk your plan as much as humanly possible, which sounds exhausting, and it can be, but at the same time, it's quite purposeful in achieving outcomes that you want to achieve. I guess the only risk with that, in going back to what is success and being purposeful, is sometimes you just plan and plan and plan, and you don't live in the moment, and you don't extract the joy of what we are currently doing. And this goes back to some of the work that we do at Fortem and at Soldieron, working with people who, funnily enough, plan all the time. That's what they do. They're planning to get to a situation. When they're in a situation, whether that be a car crash or a house fire or the current floods that are occurring, they're then planning as to how to best support the people impacted by those disasters. And then they're also looking at how to support their own people in responding to those issues. And so constantly planning can be quite purposeful and achieve the outcome you require. But if you just do that all the time, sometimes you miss what you're currently doing in the present. And that is an aspect that we try to work with others, and something that I've had to work with myself, because you're right, you just sit there and you're constantly looking at the future. You sometimes look back a little bit, but if you look at the future all the time, you do miss the living in the now.
And I guess a lot of this is just because people are looking for that quick fix of happiness, right? They'll keep planning to mitigate the negatives with the hope that if they mitigate enough negatives, then they're going to have positives. So if they stop all the things that are going to make them unhappy then in the short term, then they're going to feel happy in the short term. And so therefore they're going to feel better, and then they feel like they're on the right track. They got those quick dopamine hits, right? Like people are like, well, I could go for a run, but man, it's really tiring. And then I could end up with like sore muscles and everything. And it's just going to be so painful, whatever. And so they subconsciously end up just on their phone and just checking TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or whatever. And they're not really doing anything productive. Do you think that's because they're not doing enough of a risk analysis far enough in? I say, but what happens if I don't go for a run? Like, what are the risks?
I guess so.
Of going for a run as well?
Well, yeah, the risk of not going for a run is obviously long-term physical benefits that you're missing out on, the mental health benefits in the short term of going for a run and being physically fit and active. So I guess people, I think, do look at that forward planning sometimes a little bit too short. So going back to I guess my experience of being in the military and then doing the work we're doing, you're looking at months, years in the future. You're not just looking at the here and now, which, as I said, sometimes can be an issue because you don't live in the here and now as much. But that's a different problem we'll get to probably to have a chat about later. But that short term, there's too much risk involved in this, I shouldn't do it. That's missing the long-term planning, which is, if we don't go for a run, if we sit on our phone, what am I missing out on? I'm missing out on social connection, that where I go for a run, I could be connected to my community, my environment. I might be able to go for a run with a bunch of friends or with some new people I don't know and build social connection. What about all the other benefits that will happen? Sure, I'll have some sore muscles, but that's my body saying I've done something quite good for my body, assuming the good soreness. And how can I then make sure in the future I don't be as sore by actually planning to run quite regularly inside what I do on a daily basis. So I think planning doesn't have to focus on the next 12 hours. It should be looking out months and years ahead, but also recognizing that things won't happen the way you plan as well. You can have the best laid plans, and as they say, they just disappear the moment someone else gets involved or the environment gets involved. It doesn't mean you stop planning. It means you change your plan and look at what you tried to de-risk and how you can then look at other options to de-risk the new way that the world has gone. It doesn't mean that all that planning was useless either, because these exercises that you use for Soldieron, for Fortem and its development, they're really powerful because they show you what could be. And sometimes if you don't think about what could be, it will never be. So, a lot of the things that we've done, we've been told ultimately that you can't do them. They're for a bigger organisation. You know, that's not the remit of a charity. Someone else will do that in the future. It shouldn't be you, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, we've thought through this and we've actually looked at it and we think we can achieve it. Will we get obstacles in the way which will make us change? Absolutely. But still, we believe in what we're doing. We've got a plan. We'll be flexible in how we achieve that plan. But without the plan, we would have never got there.
So, and what I'm hearing you share is basically delayed gratification, right? Like you need the plan. You need to make sure you're doing it. You need to continue to assess whether or not you're still on track, and you've got to be intentional and forward thinking. But it's also about not just being able to enjoy the things now and making sure you're getting results right now. It's about getting results further down the line, or hopefully getting better results further down the line.
Yeah, that is true. You might not actually get better results down the line. There is a risk there that your plan won't pay off, that your plan won't be successful. But that's life. If you don't try, you won't achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve anyway. So I think it's recognizing that risk and asking yourself again, going back to your purpose, what is my purpose here? And for me, as I said, that's my definition of success. So perhaps it should be instead, what do I want to succeed at? And then recognizing that success is not some, I think anyway, utopia that you achieve and that's it. It's a constant evolving thing that is, I don't think, ever truly achievable. If you look through history at people who are successful, they've had multiple periods where they were not. They were incarcerated. They were seen as pariahs by society. Their theories were often identified by others as wrong. So I think holding to what you consider as success, which for me is a definition of purpose, really ensures that you don't chase the sugar hit. It is about that long-term block building. And that also means that the pressure's off a little bit as well, because it's not some golden cup that you're racing to. And if you don't achieve, you're a failure. You recognize that things will happen that just won't achieve the outcomes you want, but that's okay because you're still living your success, or for me, my purpose.
Yeah, I relate to what you're sharing, especially because, I believe that most things that are worthwhile don't come easy. Mm-hmm. And what you're sharing is you got to do the hard work in order to get the results that will feel worthwhile, feel meaningful, make you feel more successful.
Yeah, and the people we work with on a daily basis, they are doing really tough work. And the work we try and do with them is that mental health journey. And, yesterday was World Mental Health Day. And I think for a lot of people still, when you say mental health, you immediately think, all right, I'll put my hand up only when I'm not well. And that results in me going to a psychologist or a clinician of some variety, and then I get better. And that's it. I start the journey again. Versus actually considering it, like the running analogy earlier, it is part and parcel of your daily life, i.e. you have to put work into it. You can't just suddenly go to someone and get fixed, if you will. Although clinical support is really important, if you want to maintain your mental health, you have to plan ahead and you have to put the effort in. And that's why the concept of mental fitness is so important. Physically, you go for that run, because otherwise, if you sit on TikTok, you'll eventually not be able to go for the run. It'll have to be a walk and then a run, because you just won't be able to. Same, if you don't look after your mental health, you get to a crisis point where you've let a lot of things go, and the community around you is going to be able to support you, but they would have been able to support you a lot better if you'd put your hand up earlier and got that support. So yeah, it's about, nothing is easy, but at the same time, if you want mental health success, putting in the effort on a regular basis is going to achieve better outcomes for you, for your family. And for the people we're working with, it's really starting to catch on, because they want to stay in their jobs for as long as they can. They want to support our community for as long as they can. they don't want to get to a point where they haven't looked after themselves and either burn out or have to be transitioned. And so looking after your physical health is absolutely key. They have tests every year on how physically fit they are usually in these organisations. And what we're looking at now is how do you build the same kind of concept with your mental health? How do you plan ahead and how do you do the hard work so that you don't have to end up in the very dark spaces that some people do?
And I'll be really keen to dive into some of the ways that you make sure you do that at Fortem and Soldieron as well. Maybe let's take a few steps back. So what was your experience in the military before you left? What was that like?
Yeah, so I grew up in a military family. So my dad was in the army. His father, my grandfather, was in the army. He was a prisoner of war at Changi, and Dad was a Vietnam veteran who fought at the Battle of Coral. So I guess growing up, the military was kind of in the blood. My brother joined the Navy, actually, and parts of my other family had also served in the military. So it was kind of the family business, if you will. I really enjoyed my career. I enjoyed the challenges and the ability to be in a leadership position. I actually really enjoyed leading people and also being led in complex environments. And the military that I joined was very different. So obviously what my dad left and the complexity of the technology and the complexity of, I guess, how you utilise a modern military, it fascinated me. It's really something that I think that architecture we understand, and perhaps we understand some of the equipment, tanks and planes, but how all that comes together from a human level, it's really, really fascinating. I then had a mate who I went to school with, and we joined the military. He deployed to Afghanistan and unfortunately was killed in 2008. And that, for me, was a watershed moment where I really wanted to, with a bunch of other friends, look at how we could support others who were wounded in that incident. And unfortunately, there was really no mechanism to do that. If you looked overseas in the UK and the US, there was multiple different organisations, and still in uniform decided that we'd have a crack at developing a charity to support those people. And that was how we set up Soldieron. So with my wife, who's a psychologist, a good friend who was a member of the Australian Air Force, we co-founded the organisation. And I stayed in the Army for 2 years before I transitioned out to run it, because we had a very lovely philanthropist who came along and said, look, this is really getting legs. It's really doing some great work, but you can't do this as a volunteer anymore. You have to actually be paid. So I'll pay a couple of your salaries to go and make it a thing. So that was the decision point to leave that military career behind. But being in the Army, I think, taught me a lot about obviously how to plan, how to work with people. But it also taught me about risk, I think, and what risk is acceptable and what risk isn't. And it taught me in that last role that I had, where I was part of the team that looked after all of the operations around the world of the Defence Force. So a very small part, I should say, very, very small part, but looking at what was happening around the world that the Australian Defence Force was involved in. And it taught me that there was a bit of a disconnect between the Australian community and what our veterans were doing. And I guess that, again, came back to that purpose, is I wanted to make sure that people understood what veterans were doing on a daily basis, but also the toll that was taking. If you see the casket coming back of someone who was killed in action, it's pretty obvious the toll that that's taken. But what you don't see is the mental health wounds of people who were overseas in Afghanistan, especially Iraq and other locations. And I guess that towards the end of my very short career, only 12 years, but towards that period, it was that was starting to become the purpose that I wanted to focus on, is how do we make the community actually care about this? How do we make people understand it's not just about those killed in action? Obviously, it's about supporting their family, but how do we support others who were physically and mentally wounded. And I guess that the training that I'd had in the Defence Force, as well as a whole bunch of mentors who supported us through this journey, allowed us to set this organisation up. I'm very proud of what it's done.
And that's, I mean, you shared that you had, you're already in a role in the military where you had like a lot of responsibility, like a lot of weight on your shoulders already. You were in a leadership role. You were involved in what was happening in the Australian Defence Forces around the whole world, and a small part, you said, but it's still, you're making key decisions that will impact people's lives and potentially the future of our country. And so that was already, like, if that's not enough of a burden for, like, most people will be like, well, okay, that's enough of a burden. Don't take any more on. But then here you are, you take a step forward and you go, you know what, that's not quite enough, because I want to take on not just that burden, but I also want to take on the responsibility for how people are feeling when they come back, and for people's mental health, which is an area which hasn't had anywhere near as much focus on either. And some could argue that that's even a greater toll or a greater weight. Is that part of who you are? You look towards how you can take on the most responsibility? Or is it just, it aligned so perfectly for you that you just felt, I've just got to help these people. I've got to help them out?
Yeah, I didn't think about it in the former context that you said. It was more just, I have to do this. In talking to my wife, we went on this really long road trip just before we started Soldieron, and at the end of that, we were talking about why this should exist, the issues, and we've been talking about this for years. So that's it. I just got to do this, And look, at the end of the day, if it's not the right thing, if it's not going to get off the ground, if someone much higher in rank comes along and says, you're not doing that, that's silly, then that's fine. But I'd kick myself if I didn't have a crack at it. And the other co-founders felt the same. It's like, we're all quite young, we're junior in our careers. Yes, we do have some responsibility, but this is an opportunity potentially to make a really sizable difference. Let's have a crack. And in doing that, I think one of the big things is it was a risk, because it could have risked my career. And in fact, it actually, ended my career. I would not have got out of the military if it wasn't to go and do this. But that's fine. I'm very lucky I did. But I think that the question I kept asking myself at the time was, what is my point in the military? And my point, as I thought, was to give back to the military and support those that I'd served with and would serve in the future. And I guess the question then was, well, how can I best serve them? Can I best serve them by staying in uniform and doing the job I'm doing? Or potentially could I support them better by setting up this organisation? And I guess, well, we know the answer. And that was kind of my my North Star. It got a bit tricky there. I had my boss's boss, a general, contact me and say, "What's this Soldieron business? We need to have a chat about that. You're doing something in uniform." And I'd gone through all the different levels to get the ticks, but still being called up by a 3-star general. It does raise the heart rate when you're a junior officer. So I had a meeting set up, but the new chairman of our organisation, who himself had been the chief of army a couple of years beforehand, spoke to said general and said, "No, they've done it all by the letter, and it's all been sorted." And so my meeting was called off 30 minutes before I was meant to go in. So I was very, very happy that happened. But I think it for me, waiting in the waiting room beforehand going, oh God, is my career over and what have I done? I was like, you know what? If it is, at least I'm true to what I think the values of the Defence Force are and my own personal values. And if that's the way it goes, then that's the way it goes. Perhaps that's a youthful view where you don't have as much to risk. I didn't have kids. I just got married. But looking back then, I'm proud of the fact that I did make that decision, because I don't think Soldieron would have existed if I didn't.
and then not Fortem either, right?
Yeah, that's
So,
true.
so you made that decision. You basically analyzed or assessed all the risks, and then you decided, okay, based on all of these risks, there are the risks if I do it, there are risks if I don't. Damned if I do, damned if I don't. Definitely damned if I don't. I'm going to do it. Like, what's the point of being in the military? And so, can you walk us through what happened after you left? You had the philanthropist say, "We need you on a full-time salary. Can't have you distracted by continuing to be in uniform. Let's focus on soldieron properly." And so, what happened from there? How did things progress? How did they grow to where you are now?
Well, I think the biggest thing with Soldieron wasn't necessarily the services that we delivered. You would have to track forward to probably 2016, 2017 before we became known really as a significant service provider of psychology services, transition employment services, social connection programs. What we really focused on to start with was those social connection programs. So providing opportunities for individuals to connect to each other. Now, there are a lot of charities out there that do great work in that respect. Not for veterans, we were the first to do that. But that doesn't really explain, I guess, the success of the organisation. And I think the reason that the organisation became so successful was because we started a conversation around the issues that I spoke about before, which is that who's supporting those people that are coming back with mental health issues, and how are we, the community, stepping up to support them. Obviously, we did a range of activities and programs. We were one of the teams that went to the South Pole with Prince Harry to try and race with a bunch of other wounded veteran organisations to the South Pole, and did a range of other things like that, which helped raise the profile. But at the end of the day, Prince Harry, fantastic for a profile perspective, but it was the message underneath it that really connected people to what Soldieron was about, and that is, we, the community, should be a part of people's lives when they return from operations overseas or from their military service, so we can support them back into our community. And I think it was that connecting point that allowed people to not just want to be a part of Soldieron from giving some money and walking away, but actually wanting to be involved in the organisation. And that grassroots, as well as obviously large-scale activities and promotion from people like Harry and prime ministers and other people, was great, but it was that grassroots question of how can I be involved as an individual when I'm seeing something, and now I can be involved through this organisation, I think grew the organisation quickly. Fast forward in 2016, we did start to actually deliver that full suite of services that Soldieron's now known for. It wasn't easy because we didn't actually receive any government funding. The organisation didn't receive any until 2000 and I have to fact check this, 2019, 18, 19. So that entire period from 2012 until 2019 was community engagement and funding, and raised over 25 million in that period from the community. And I think it just shows how much people wanted to be a part of the support for veterans and their families. It was really something that they'd wanted to do a lot of, and not just on Anzac Day, not clapping on the side of a parade. They wanted to do that, but they also wanted to be actively involved in veterans' lives. So I think that's the reason that we were successful during that period. And being successful in that communication allowed us to be successful from a delivery perspective as well, because we recognised charities can be just a message creation tool, and that's fine, but we didn't want to do that. We wanted to create a message, but we also wanted to deliver high quality services because we felt both were required. And so going through that process, we're able to do both.
And so at some stage, though, you transitioned from Soldieron and created Fortem. And so you expanded beyond just military to all first responders. How did that change come about?
Well, I guess it was a personal change, as well as a consideration we had right from the get-go of Soldieron, actually. So when we met as an organisation, we had Mark Donaldson as one of our patrons. Mark's a Victoria Cross recipient, one of the only living recipients who secured his was awarded, in fact, his Victoria Cross in 2008 for actions in Afghanistan. And his remit was, we shouldn't be just looking after veterans, we should be also looking after first responders. So that was right back when he became our patron back in 2012. For me personally, I had a bunch of friends who had transitioned from the military and moved into first responder agencies, and they had recognised that the support they were getting from Soldieron, from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and from all these other charities and entities was fantastic. But their mates who they were serving with, they weren't getting much. Now, yes, the agencies were doing a little bit, but they were getting nothing from the community. If they put their hand up and said, look, I want a social connection activity, I want this, I want this, I want this, it didn't exist. And they said, well, why are we not doing that? The amount of trauma I've seen as a member of the Australian Defence Force was, it was significant. But the amount of trauma I'm seeing as a paramedic now is incredible. Yet I can get all this support because I was a veteran, yet my mates can't get anything and they're seeing all this trauma. So from a personal perspective, it felt quite unfair, really, that there was a whole group of people who also wore a uniform, were supporting us, the community, in our worst moments, but really, A, weren't being recognised, and B, were just not receiving the opportunities that were going to mean that they weren't going to go into that critical mental health area that many can if they don't receive that early support. So with those in mind, we decided, you know what, Soldieron's in a good place. It's delivering great services. There's a new thing that we want to do. So we spoke to the federal government at the time and said, this is the plan. And we especially focused on the agencies that we've been working with, which is Australian Federal Police and Australian Border Force as national agencies, and said, look, let's pilot this and see if it works. And it did. And we were just kicking that off and delivering some services when the Black Summer fires occurred. And funnily enough, the issues raised within inside that identified the needs of an organisation like Fortem. We went through a competitive grant process and secured some significant federal government funding, and then delivered a whole bunch of services in the burn scar to those people impacted by first responders, I should say, and their families impacted by the Black Summer fires. On top of that, obviously, we've had
COVID. So that was late 2019, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So third birthday yesterday, the World Mental Health Day. So we kicked off in October 2019 and straight into Black Summer, which we received funding for the next year, obviously after most of the fires had occurred, and then followed by COVID and then the floods. So the 3 years that Fortem has existed, it has been probably one of the most significant 3 years in first responder history. And this is not to mention just the daily routine that these first responders see, where there's trauma, simple trauma that they see every day, which is not simple to us, but car accidents and homicides and domestic violence and bushfires, smaller scale, obviously, than Black Summer, floods. It's a really complex job, and having the layer of major natural disasters and the pandemic on top has really stretched these people. So in hindsight, I'm so glad that we did set up before all of this happened, because we've really helped a lot of people who wouldn't be in as good a space as they are now.
And so you've mentioned a couple of times now different levels or intensities of trauma, but also different frequencies as well. So I can imagine, like, for most people think about military and they're thinking about being on the battlefield and trauma of having guns and bombs being thrown at you or coming your way. Like that's pretty intense. And then you're talking about car accidents and floods and being a paramedic and probably having people abusing you and the like as well, which are relevant for first responders. Who else is experiencing trauma? Like, is everyone experiencing trauma, or is there kind of like a level where it's like, this is where we really need support for?
I think there's roles outside of the ones that I've spoken about which receive trauma. Obviously, if you look at any hospital, ER, you'll see trauma. Different levels, obviously, but there is trauma there. You can see trauma within inside the corrections services, often some of the things that those communities see. And you can experience trauma on a personal level if you are subject, obviously, to some of the things that were spoken about, such as domestic violence or a car crash or those kind of things. So that can affect you as well. I think as far as who should be supported through what we're doing, I guess our focus is on those people who see trauma literally as part of their profession. So trauma doesn't happen to them as an accident. It is part of them responding to it through paid or volunteer employment. So I guess that's our cutoff. Not to say there's other groups that aren't in that community, but I think when you look at veterans and first responders, you've got a significant amount of those. Others can see it and do see it. And to be frank, there should be support for them as well. But that's our group. I guess we've all been a little bit traumatised by, I think, the pandemic and COVID, and depending on where you were, the Black Summer fires, and where you are right now, the floods. So there are those things that, from a community perspective, trauma will occur. But the duration of that trauma is usually shorter, and it's trauma that happens to you. As I said, it's not trauma that you have to respond to because it's your job. The difference on how you support that trauma is different. And for those that seek it out because it's part of their job or have it sought out for them, is a better way to put it, I should say, they have to become more resilient to it because it is literally part of their job. Now, some of the resilience that we've seen in this community beforehand has been, to be frank, a macho resilience of it'll be fine, drink the hard coffee made of concrete, and, this is just the job, get on with it. What we're seeing, though, is that from a veteran perspective, that just leads to long-term issues. So how do you support people so that they can continue to see trauma, but at the same time be able to contextualize that trauma, talk about that trauma, be connected to others who go through the same trauma, look after their mental fitness, and then also support the community and their family so that they can continue this job, and it's not something where they just do it a couple of months or years and that's it, that they can't do it anymore. I think that's the key that we're focusing on, is how do you not stop trauma? Because literally you can't stop trauma for this community. It is part of their job description. But how do you support them so that they can go and do it continually? And I'll jump back just really quickly. For communities that are traumatised or individuals that are traumatised, it is very different. And I'm not in any way, shape or form the best person to talk about that. But from what we've seen, there is a difference there because it's a trauma that is quite contained, and working through that to build trust is a real key element, and it's a different focal point. Whereas we're trying to put the protective wrapping around people that are seeing trauma, those that the trauma has occurred to, it needs to be more of a focus on rebuilding that trust and rebuilding that person, where we're trying to protect the person, if you will. So two different models.
I hear what you're saying. It's not so much responding to the trauma, but it's helping people build resilience from the trauma that they might face.
Yeah, and because responding, if you do this after the fact, so if you go and continually see trauma and then support the person after the trauma, all the evidence shows that it doesn't achieve the outcomes in the long term. Those debriefing tools, as important as they are, they can still not provide that preventative tool, and that preventative tool reduces your risk factors. So having strong social networks and connections and not being socially isolated, having really good access to mental health, having strong family connections, purpose and meaning outside of the work environment, and also having a good sense of humor and being physically fit and well, all of these things. And so what we do as an organisation is underpin what we do by the 5 ways to wellbeing, which is a model around preventative mental health, which is run by the Royal Melbourne Foundation. So it's an evidence-informed practice that originally came from the UK, from the NHS, but it's been taken here to Australia and to Melbourne. And again, it goes through a bunch of different things that we should collectively, as individuals, regardless of if we're in high trauma situations or not, we should be putting into our daily practice to make sure that we are more resilient. Because yes, first responders see trauma, but in all our lives, there could be trauma. The loss of a loved one, the diagnosis of someone close to us, or the loss of financial security. There's so many things that can occur that you just cannot control and never will be able to control. So having the ability to respond to them because you're in a good situation, because you've worked on it and you've put in those strong mechanisms, that's really key for everyone, but obviously especially for first responders.
So what are those 5 things?
So the 5 ways to wellbeing was first, was it 2000 and I think it was 2005, and the NHS decided that this was something that was actually going to be a preventative model for them as an organisation. And they recognised that if, as an organisation, they could put in place a range of tools that could support people, it would ensure that ultimately less people were actually going to go down the path of poor mental health and wellbeing. So the 5 ways are to firstly connect, be active, keep learning, be aware, and help others. So each of those are not really complex. Okay. They're really simple, really. But to connect, be active, keep learning, be aware, and help others. And some of those are intrinsic within inside being a first responder. Obviously, helping others is just part of the job, literally what you signed up to do. But connect is one of the things that first responders have found actually traditionally do quite poorly, especially for police. So if you're in and have been in the police force for a good couple of years, the way you see society is very different to the way the average person sees society. You see society through a lens, and that lens is not particularly flattering. It sees everyone potentially in a context that you and I wouldn't see them in. And subsequently, what we're finding with police is actually they struggle to connect in many instances outside of their community, because in many respects they don't trust people outside of their community. And they've been given good reason in many instances to not trust people outside of their community. So it's about building stronger networks, firstly with inside police, but also broadening that horizon, firstly from our perspective to other first responders, but also other first responder families. So there's a wider network, because being isolated and just doing the job, if you will, can make you quite jaded. You see the world in such a way that you don't really want to. You don't see the good in the world, because often you're not seeing the good in the world. Same with paramedics often. You walk out and you see accidents. You see things that are going wrong. And as you mentioned earlier, Harry, sometimes you get assaulted for doing your job. So you're literally going out and helping people in what you think is their worst moments, and you come back having been spat at or shouted at. So those things make you withdraw from the community. So connecting is really critical. Being active, it goes without saying that being physically active and being physically fit is really key to everyone's mental health. But in saying that, a lot of people don't put it in their weekly schedule, especially if you're a first responder and you are on night shifts and shift work in general. Finding the time to be physically active can be quite complex. So what we try and do is build some connection programs, which are also focused on physical activity. So we've got walking groups, we've got yoga, we've got running groups, we've got cycling, stand-up paddleboarding, kayaking, a whole bunch of things. And yes, the physical activity is key, but obviously the social connection is as well. Keep learning. One of the things that I think that we forget, we think that it's perhaps something that we only have to do at school or university, but actually maintaining that healthy appetite for wanting to be active in a learning capacity, having that curiosity of what is the world about and how can I better understand it. And again, what we do is arrange a number of different activities. So you can learn how to play guitar, you can do painting, cooking classes, a whole bunch of different things that people suddenly, instead of just thinking about work, family, work, actually they're starting to create something outside of that, which is getting those creative juices going again. And for many, it has been years since they've done it. Be aware, as I said right at the start, sometimes planning ahead, being in the military and being a first responder, that's what you do all the time. You never live in the moment. You're just constantly thinking about what is the future, what are the risks in the future, and how am I going to mitigate those risks. You don't even look back that much. You don't go, oh, yeah, I've achieved this or that. You just, well, that was the past. I'm focused on the future and how to live it best by planning, which means often you're not thinking about the senses that you have as a person and the way that they're connecting you to the environment that you're in at the moment. And I mean, that's something that everyone should be focused on. But I think the communities we work with, especially so, they are so focused. I was lucky enough to give a graduation speech recently at the university. I went to UNSW, the Canberra version. But that was the speech. It was to start out, be connected with what you're doing. Because I didn't, when I went through, that was all, what do I do next? I'll finish this, tick the box, let's go and do stuff that's real life. And you forget just how much of a moment it is to have secured, for me, the first person in my family to go through university. It was a really big moment. And I didn't miss it, but I wasn't connected to it. So it was nice to go back and say, hey, don't stuff up like I did. Actually be connected with the moment. And that's what we try and do with our first responders and veterans is, yes, you can plan, and that's fantastic. Firstly, planning is important. Secondly, it's not going to stop bad things happening because they will still happen. You have to plan around them. But third, make sure you're actually still connected to what you're doing right now. Actually talk to your family. Put down the email. Have a chat to your kids if you've got them. Talk to your partner. Talk to your friends and actually connect, because that's ultimately as much a part of living as is your job, what should be. And finally, help others. As I said, easy one. Yeah. Easy one for this community. It's literally what they do.
Right? That's the simple one, especially for the first responders, right? And but to anyone else who's listening to this who isn't a first responder, I think they'll still relate to the idea of helping others as something which they've got to proactively do and making sure they're supporting. Which brings me to my next question, is that if someone's listening to this and either they're a leader in their organization or they're just a leader for people around them, they're connected with friends and family, and they take some form of leadership role in the community or social groups which they're in, what can they do to basically reduce burnout and build up resilience to avoid the really poor mental health issues that people can face? What can they do to support others?
I think the first thing is to build a bit of knowledge around what is good mental health. And so looking at some of the literacy that's out there. Yes, our website and what we do is very much focused on first responders, but we do have a lot of literacy on our website, fortemaustralia.org.au. And I think that's the first place. It's like, I guess, doing anything. It's that planning. You need to do the research first before you can plan. So I'd suggest that's the first place, is what's out there. What are the key signs of burnout? How do I, as a leader, look after my people from making sure they have the off-roads or the off-ramps, if you will, to be able to secure some professional help if they need to? What do I need to do in the work environment to create that honest, transparent culture, to be able to put my hand up and say it's too much of this or that in my work environment. I need to step away from that. I'm not achieving X or Y because I am feeling not 100%, and for that not to be an immediate negative in that person's career. I think the next step is to recognize that the 21st century and leadership is a lot more complex than potentially it ever has been, with competing priorities, with now a lot of work from home, with often both partners in longer term relationships working with children as well. The complexity of the modern day is a lot harder, yet we don't actively put effort into our mental fitness. And so I think from a leadership perspective, focusing on how can I bring mental fitness into every day for my people? How can I support them achieve their best resilience by actually allowing them and giving them some time to focus on their mental fitness? And so one of the things that we did at Fortem 2 years ago now is set up a program, and that program is based really around mental fitness, and it's supporting people trying to look after their breathing, trying to look after, I guess, when you have negative thoughts, making sure that you plan, but also journal what has happened to you and how you feel about it, so that you can unload your brain a little bit from some of the things that happen in your daily life, looking at how you connect with other people. And I think it's those things that leaders, those resources that leaders need to be actively searching for. So how can I use these tools to make sure my people can be at their best? Because it's tough. It's tough just turning up and doing things in the modern era with so many different competing priorities, and to stay focused and to be able to be purposeful and hopefully attain happiness in that moment. You really have to put the work in, and that's just not for the person, it's for the leader as well.
And I guess bring it right back to the beginning of the conversation. We're talking to that leader who's listening to this, is what's your purpose? Are you just looking for happiness right now, which would probably lead you to take very different actions or very different steps than if you're looking at what's your purpose as a leader where you're responsible for other people?
Yeah, and that changes the dynamic completely.
Completely, right? I mean, which brings me to the focus of, like, you've built two highly successful, purpose-driven organizations. They haven't been for profit, but as you said, for one of them, you didn't get any funding, or any government funding at least, or grants, for a number of years. And you need to really prove it before you got any of the funding. So I think a lot of people can also learn from your business success as well. What have been some of the challenges that you've faced as you built it up, both leadership as well as just business challenges?
Yeah, I guess the big thing is no one goes to a VC and says, I've got a charity idea, will you give me funding for the startup? You have to prove it. So it is all belt strapping. You've got to do it all yourself. And it's hard. I was lucky to kind of get that VC equivalent, if you will, 2 and a bit years in, when we did get someone who said, I want to take this to the next level. But I know that's unusual. But at the same time, we poured every waking moment into getting us to that stage. I think the biggest business lessons, if you will, is keeping that purpose clear and recognizing that some of the risks you're taking could potentially break what you've built. But at the same time, the outcomes would significantly change the game. And so, for example, we took on a transition and employment program for Soldieron several years ago, with no funding at all. There's been no funding pipeline at all allocated to it. We believed in it. We had a little bit of startup funding from some other fundraising we'd achieved, and we put quite a lot of effort into it. It's now one of the most successful parts of Soldieron, but it only received government funding again 2 years ago. So it was a big period of time where it was losing money, and it was hard to balance the books and make sure you can continue to deliver these high quality services. I think leading people who are also incredibly purpose driven is hard, because in the military you're purpose driven, but you're purpose driven in a context, and that context is quite hierarchical. It's teams driven, but you're also cut from a very similar cloth. When you look at non-for-profits, you've got people who are incredibly purpose-driven, and that can be hard sometimes to lead. It's purpose-driven, but sometimes it's purpose-driven on my way, because I know the best way, because my purpose is stronger than potentially your purpose. And so being a leader of that community, it can be really, really tough, because you have to highlight what is the greater purpose of the organisation and how does your individual purpose sit within inside that. And ultimately, some people get to the point where they say, well, the organisation's purpose doesn't align with my purpose and I'm going to leave. And that's fine. But I think it's being a strong enough leader to be able to provide that architecture. And that's hard as well. I guess the other thing that's been from a business perspective is, you wouldn't expect this, but in the veteran space, it can be, how do I put this? It can be a bit competitive. So you've got all these different charities vying for the same dollar. You've got older charities that have been around for 100 years, and then you've got newer charities, and then you've got Facebook groups that, that's, to be fair, that's where we started. And that can take a toll sometimes as well, that you're not working together. Sometimes you're actually competing for the same dollar or competing for the same service. And that was a real eye-opener. You think that people are like you and are purpose-driven and want to create the best outcomes. But sometimes their purpose is more about retaining what exists and the organisation's brand, or the organisation's position in the market, if you will. So you used a word there, business, and I guess we didn't treat it as a business in that respect. We treated it as a business in many of the other aspects, but we didn't treat it as a business in that respect. And quickly had to, because you realise that some people do see you as a competitor, which is a bit of a values alignment for us to go, wow, this is not what we expected. Are we comfortable still working in this space? And of course we said yes, but then you have to work out, well, how are we going to stay true to your values, but also recognise that other people are seeing you as competitors? How do you work with them, noting they see you as that? Do we see them as competitors? Does that align with our values and our purpose? No, it doesn't. So how do we work with them? I think that was one of the more complex issues is how do you do that? How do you still maintain a business focus, if you will, and a strategy, while at the same time retaining your purpose and therefore your underpinned values?
I'm smiling because just as you were sharing that, I was thinking about my role as a father. I've got a almost 3-year-old, and I have a plan. I have a purpose. I have an objective. I'm trying to get something done. Out trying to do grocery shopping, or trying to just get her to childcare or whatever, right? And she can clearly have a different objective, and she can start to treat me like the enemy, as most toddlers eventually will. And so, hang on, but if I'm seeing her as treating me as the enemy, does that mean that I'm her enemy? Do I need to treat her as the same? Hang on a second, let's take a step back. How is all of this whole journey, this experience that you've had from basically following the military's purpose to defining your own, to then living it and creating the businesses, how's that aligned with, supported, being challenged by, and also being propelled forward by your role as a husband and a father?
I think the first part is that with Soldieron, it was my wife and I who set it up, and we kind of joked that it was our first kid, to which we actually had our first in the first year actually of Soldieron. I'm really, like, that was an amazing period. My wife now doesn't work in Fortem, and that's really been good as well, because it's allowed us to have a separation of what we do from a work perspective, so that we can have conversations about our respective works, but they're not the same conversation, and that's been wonderful. That being said, doing something like that and building something together has been really great. Having kids, though, I think is one of the best things that's ever happened, or is the best thing that's ever happened to me. Firstly, because they're amazing, and they certainly challenge you. But I think the other aspect in going back to your point is that I think kids really ground you as well. They make you have to communicate in such a way that you can't just write over the top, because no toddler has ever been told what to do and then followed through on it. It just doesn't work. And now I'm lucky. I've got 4 kids, ranging from 10 years old to just turned 1, which keeps us very, very busy. But all of them are different people, and allows us to be really grounded and connect into that family life, which, as I said right at the get-go, we wouldn't have done this without it. That family life has just been, that's my number one purpose. And I think when you have such a purposeful job as I do, and I'm very lucky to have, and I've also obviously had previously with soldieron and with the military, it's a bit of a trap sometimes that you could think of those purposeful jobs as your key purpose and as the value that underpins, I guess, you as an individual. But for me, I've been through that, and I got sucked in, especially with the soldieron side, where I was soldieron. That was it. Like, it was, I lived it, I breathed it. My kids were there, but I wasn't present with them. You know, my wife was there, I wasn't present with her, except for when we were talking about soldieron, and made that decision that that's not my purpose. My purpose from a work environment is absolutely to give back to the community and do everything I possibly can. But my main purpose as a human being is to be the best dad, best husband that I can be. And that, I think, is something that I just never would have had if I didn't have a family. And ultimately, as proud as I am of what I did at soldieron, when I left the organisation to set up Fortem, and the phone stopped ringing about certain veteran issues or this or that, you look back and you go, it's a bit of a blur, and it was a lot of stress, and I'm so proud of what I've achieved. But what's the thing that I've, I guess, not done that I regret? And the only thing that really came up that I regretted is again, being mentally disconnected from my kids during a significant period there. And same with my wife, and that was the promise I made to myself with the next charity. How do I not do that this time? How do I make sure I am there present? When we're talking, I'm talking back. I'm not on my phone. How do I make that a key component of my life? And how does it then flow into the rest of my life? Not as a burden, as something that's holding me back, but quite the opposite, as something that's grounding me and making me understand that the ups and downs of life and work are there, but ultimately my family is my safe haven. And yeah, I think I'm lucky that I found that, because some people don't find that until long after their, unfortunately, family life can break down, and they go, perhaps that's something that I jeopardized my family life for work. And even when you have the most purposeful job in the world, is that worth it? And even then, is it the right thing to do? Because I don't know if it makes you better at your job. I actually think it's quite the opposite. So I think that's the big epiphany for me from that period, is the family for me is critical to all my success. And hopefully I'm critical to all theirs.
That's beautiful. I'm really mindful of time because we're cutting it fine as well. All right, what I'm hearing you say there is that you need to have a more holistic definition of your purpose. It can't just be the purpose of your career, or the purpose of what you do at work, or the purpose for your health, or your purpose for your mental health, or your purpose for your family. It sounds like it's got to be all of those. And someone listening to this might be thinking, man, that sounds amazing. John's worked out how to do it. He's gone through all the hard yards. He's put so much effort and passion into his career. It almost looks effortless. But then here he is sharing that he's really struggled with making sure that he balances that with his family. He's got 4 kids and he's a proud husband, a proud dad. And how's he balancing all of this? How can you, or what advice would you be able to give to the people who are listening to learn to work smarter, not harder, and to define their purpose in a way that actually works with all other areas of their life?
Well, I think what you said first, Harry, is critical, is you need to see it in a holistic context. I reached success, if you will, through Soldieron, and got connected to well-known people, and young CEO of a charity that was going places. It does go to your head a bit, and as I said, it became about the job, and I was successful in the job, but I was losing things that I was being supported through with my own mental health journey, and through a coach, an executive coach, to actually hang on. I'm not happy, and as I said, purpose doesn't achieve happiness, but it was more than that. It was, hang on, there's something missing here. I've got this purpose, and I came back to realizing that it was just a career purpose. Yeah, I was ticking the career purpose and then some, but the rest of my life, I wasn't connecting to friends. And when I did connect to friends, it was all like, hey, how you going? Good. Have you heard of Soldieron? We need to talk about Soldieron. And so, how are your kids? Good. Yeah. Have you heard about Soldieron? So it showed me that, you need to have that holistic focus. I guess the other aspect is actually putting some effort into this. We plan, most people plan their careers a lot. They think about what job they want to do, when they want to do it, how it makes you happy, how it doesn't, what's their purpose, meaning, and values. But I highly doubt they look at their life in a holistic context and say, well, what is my success, if you will? And for me, as I said, my purpose across all of these different things, and how does that align to my daily life? I think in doing that, and I still trip quite a lot sometimes. Work invades my life, and when the stress is on, it can be hard to maintain the purpose across these things. But forgiving yourself and then being able to go back and say, well, I stumbled. Why? And how do I get back to that equilibrium? I think you first need to know what that equilibrium is. So I'd say that that's the first point, in fact, of starting this. What is it across your life that gives you purpose in each of the different domains of your life? And then how do you put those things in place, noting that, of course, life will throw you curveballs and things will happen, but how do you best try to achieve those things as much as you can?
That's amazing. You're both practical and proactive. And then I suspect what really separates you from others is you then take action on what you decide you're going to do.
Try my best.
We all are. No, that was great. Is there anything else that you'd want to share, or you're stuck with
No, I think I've waffled enough.
No, you got to run. You've waffled enough. Thank you. So that was a really, really inspiring and wonderful conversation. I'm very grateful I was able to have that with John, and I appreciate his time. He shared some great insights. And to sum it up for you quickly, basically how we define success. Well, for him, it's about following your purpose, which means you got to find out what your purpose is, which means you need to know what you want to do in this world. You need to know what your values are. You need to know what type of life is worthwhile living, which you're leaving behind. So when you're on your deathbed, or if you were to imagine what someone's saying at your funeral, what do they want you to be talking about in terms of your achievements and your successes? Because clearly your success is not something that you achieve. It's not something that you get to. It's a constant. It's evolving. It's never achievable. It's never attainable. And while a lot of guests here have spoken about their successes, about how happy they can be, what John's talking about is happiness is great. And a lot of the time when you're pursuing your purpose, you're going to feel happy. It's natural that that's going to come. But happiness isn't success. Your purpose is. And there are a lot of times when you're pursuing your purpose that you're not necessarily going to feel happy. And so the way that John does a lot of this is that he focuses on the risks, both the risks of doing something and the risks of not doing something as well. He's focusing on how can I make sure that I'm getting the best possible outcome from the actions that I'm taking and from the effort and the energy which I'm putting into these different things in my life. And so from the military, he was doing months and years of planning. And If you don't think about what could be, it never will be. I loved it when he said that. Basically, a mate of his was killed in 2008, and while his friend had a lot of kind of support, or his friend's family had a lot of support, he saw a lot of veterans who didn't have the support from PTSD and from anxiety and from trauma, which they were having in service. And that means you have both physical wounds, but also the mental wounds. And for John, in terms of how he found his purpose and how he's become so successful, is he has this, you could tell from the conversation there a few times, it's like, I just have to do this. Like, what's the point of doing what I'm currently doing? There's so much more purpose in this. And so he moves towards it, and he sticks to it as well. He doesn't just go to it and go, oh, it's too hard, I got to give up. It becomes everything. It consumes him, which has actually cost his family at times. It's cost other areas. And so you need to become more holistic in terms of your purpose. But he expanded that from just focusing on veterans to focusing on everyone who deals with trauma, especially people who are first responders, so paramedics and police officers and people who work in other government agencies or other areas where they're putting their lives on the line, or they're seeing death and trauma every single day. It's literally what their job is. And so he's made this amazing point about mental fitness versus mental health. It says, once against the mental health, it's already too far down the line. You need clinical support. You really need a lot of help. And it's a lot of effort and a lot of time and energy and resources dedicated to bring you back up from like really poor mental health. But if you focus on your mental fitness, it's like focusing on your ability to run or to be able to run a good distance or to be healthy physically. It's much easier to maintain healthy than it is to become really unhealthy and then get to a reasonably healthy state. So for John, really, he's just been looking at what opportunities are there to avoid mental health in the different areas in our society. And the core answer to that is you've got to build up resilience. You've got to make sure that you help people connect with others in a positive way, to be more active and do exercise, to keep learning and trying new things, to be aware of your successes and where you've gotten to already, and also just to make sure you're helping others. I can imagine a lot of people who are in roles where they need to help others will get to a point of going, I have to go and help these people now. Oh, I have to, it's my job. But to be mindful of your purpose in each of those and being connected and to continue to learn and to being aware and to making sure that you're helping others and just all of that. When you focus on that, then you're going to build up your own resilience and you're going to be able to avoid getting into a state of poor mental health because you're building up your mental fitness. And so we spoke a lot about how John is as a husband and a father and how career shaped his family, but also how family has shaped who he is and his career today as well. And he just stresses that you just got to focus on what's most important. And you got to be honest with yourself about what really is most important for you. And so that comes right back to this idea of your holistic purpose, rather than just focusing on your purpose in your career or your purpose in your job or your purpose in at home as your role in your family, or your purpose as a sibling or a daughter or son, or your purpose with your friends. You need to look at your overall purpose in your life and then decide for yourself what's most important to you. Hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to having you at the next one. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Success with Purpose, and I also hope that you feel capable to apply some of the perspectives and learnings from this episode in your own life. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to like and subscribe below. And until next time, live with purpose.